The year is 1859, and for the first time in nearly 25 years, the two greatest powers on Earth are on the verge of war. There are troops assembled, ultimatums issued, and citizens preparing for battle. But when the smoke clears, no shots were fired, no lives lost, and all because of this little guy. Now, before we get into this episode's title character, allow me to set the stage. Since the end of the War of 1812, the United States and the United Kingdom have enjoyed remarkably peaceful relations. This is somewhat surprising given that during this period, the two countries also competed with each other for territory and influence across North America. This struggle would come to be known as manifest destiny. At the heart of the matter was this: neither country could agree on where the border between British Canada and American Oregon country actually was. In 1846, the two sides finally came to an agreement, settling the boundary along the 49th parallel to the west until reaching the Rocky Mountains, at which point the border would follow the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. But while the deal ended the Oregon boundary dispute, it left another conflict unresolved, namely over the San Juan Islands, a group of islands located between Vancouver Island and the Washington Territory. To explain why this was an issue, let me turn to someone far more knowledgeable than I am. Hi there, everyone. I'm one half of the team that brings you this channel. For thousands of years, these islands were inhabited by First Nations peoples and were known as the Salish Sea Islands. Then in the mid-1700s, European explorers arrived and claimed the islands for the various kingdoms of Europe. When the United States declared independence from Britain, it inherited a claim to the region, though it wasn't recognized by anyone else. At the same time, the British had established 3 colonies in what is today the Pacific Northwest. The Hudson's Bay Company controlled the interior of British Columbia, while Vancouver Island and the mainland to its south were governed directly by the British Crown as part of the colony of Vancouver Island. Because of the lack of population, economic activity, or military resources, no side paid much attention to the islands until the early 1850s. That's when American settlers started to trickle into the area. As such, both the U.S. and Britain felt compelled to assert their competing claims, and thus the Northwestern boundary dispute was born. In 1857, the U.S. dispatched the USS Rattlesnake to occupy the islands. 2 years later, the British sent HMS Tribune to do the same. In order to prevent any violence, the Americans chose to station their forces on San Juan Island, while the British took up positions on Vancouver Island. Here they remained for months in a standoff until the question of who owned the islands could be settled diplomatically. Enter Lyman Cutler, an American farmer who had settled on San Juan Island in 1856. Over the course of the summer, he noticed a growing number of pigs rooting around his property, searching for food. Initially, he didn't think much of it, but after discovering the next morning that they had eaten several potatoes from his garden, he decided enough was enough. So the following day, August 1859, Cutler got into his boat and went out to the middle of the straits between the two islands. He then proceeded to shoot and kill one of the pigs. As it turns out, the animal belonged to an American trader named Charles Wilkes, who was doing business with the Hudson's Bay Company. The company in turn leased the pig from one of the British soldiers stationed on Vancouver Island, making it technically British property. Cutler, however, was not concerned with such niceties. To him, the pig had trespassed onto his land and eaten his vegetables. He then took the dead animal back to shore and butchered it. And that's about where the story might have ended. After all, shooting someone else's pet pig hardly seems like cause for international incident, but as I mentioned earlier, diplomatic discussions regarding the ownership of the San Juan Islands were ongoing and tensions were already high between the two occupying powers. Within days of the pig assassination, American Naval Commander General William S. Harney received word of the incident and immediately ordered troops to seize Cutler's farm as punishment, but the order came too late. British Naval Commander Captain Geoffrey Crescentbanes had already marched his men to Cutler's farm, raised the Union Jack, and declared it British territory. Harney was furious. If this was a trick to provoke the Americans into starting a fight, it was working. His first reaction was to march on the British and relieve Cutler's farm by force. But he ultimately decided that such a move would be unwise without orders from Washington, D.C. While waiting for word, he did his best to make the island ready for defense, calling on able-bodied American settlers to join the effort. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, arousing nationalist passions on both sides of the border. In Victoria, British citizens prepared to defend the island, while Americans in Seattle did the same for San Juan Island. Newspapers across the United States carried stories of the brave Americans holding down Fort Casey against the heavily armed British, though in reality, the situation was not nearly so dramatic. Nevertheless, thousands of American volunteers would eventually assemble near the Puget Sound, eager to defend their country's honor. Meanwhile, Britain also prepared for war. Not only were the Royal Navy and the Army placing ships and troops on alert, but the Royal Canadian Navy also mobilized, dispatching to warships to monitor developments. Despite the preparations, no one really wanted a war. Both the US and Britain knew that a large-scale conflict would be disastrous. So they attempted to resolve the crisis diplomatically. In October 1859, representatives from both sides met aboard the HMS Tribune to discuss the situation. Unfortunately for the British, the presence of American troops on San Juan Island made it difficult for them to negotiate from a position of strength. They therefore agreed to withdraw their forces to Vancouver Island, pending the results of the diplomatic talks. The Americans refused to budge, however, insisting that the British first remove their troops from San Juan Island. This stalemate would last for 2 years. By 1861, the crisis had largely faded from public memory. However, the outbreak of the American Civil War soon overshadowed all other events in the United States, including the standoff over the San Juan Islands. In fact, the conflict almost certainly saved the British, had the war not intervened. It is very likely that President James Buchanan would have ordered the seizure of Vancouver Island to punish the British for the pig incident. As it was, the US simply couldn't spare the men and resources necessary to mount such an operation. With the immediate crisis averted, Britain found itself in a unique position. The US was now embroiled in a bloody civil war, and American claims to the Pacific Northwest suddenly seemed less pressing. London therefore dispatched diplomat Sir Edward Blake to Washington, D.C. to secure an agreement. Though to his disappointment, he found that pro-slavery Southerners were still bitterly opposed to any sort of compromise with the North. Finally, in June 1866, the United States Senate ratified the Treaty of Washington. The agreement resolved the boundary dispute in favor of the U.S., giving it the southernmost islands in the archipelago. While many Americans felt betrayed by the deal, most recognized that the country simply couldn't afford to go to war with Britain over a few pig-infested islands. The British also came away feeling satisfied with the outcome. With the treaty, the U.S. had formally acknowledged the existence of the colony of Vancouver Island and thereby recognized British sovereignty over the rest of the archipelago. As for Mr. Cutler, the man who shot the pig, he received a formal apology from the British government and a pair of silver-mounted pistols from the state of Washington. He lived the rest of his life on San Juan Island, where he died in 1893. And on that ends our latest episode. Thank you for watching, and a big thank you to our supporters who make it possible for us to bring these videos to you every week. You can learn more about them by visiting our support page.